Do you even know that narcissistic abuse has several silent ways of creeping into your daily life? You just wake up one day feeling drained, anxious, or like you're constantly walking on eggshells even when no one is around to criticize you. That's because narcissistic abuse doesn't just disappear when the person is gone. It leaves little traps in your mind, shaping how you see yourself and the world. So, let's talk about these silent ways it creeps in, because once you see them, you can start taking back control. Are you ready for number 1? Doubting your perception of reality. Have you ever been sure something happened only for someone to convince you it didn't? That's the silent poison of narcissistic abuse. It makes you doubt your reality. You remember them saying something hurtful, but when you bring it up, they deny it, call you too sensitive, or say you're imagining things. Over time, you start questioning yourself and apologizing for things that weren't your fault. As psychoanalyst Dr. Robin Stern explains in her book, The Gaslight Effect, gaslighting erodes your sense of reality until you rely on the abuser to define it for you. The worst part is that it leaks into your everyday life. You might start second-guessing yourself at work, hesitating before speaking up in meetings because you're afraid of being wrong. Even picking a meal can feel stressful if you're used to being told that your choices aren't good enough. But here's the truth. Your perception isn't broken. It's been manipulated. The first step to breaking free is recognizing that your thoughts and feelings are valid, no matter how much someone tries to rewrite your story. Let's talk about number 2. Fear of expressing opinions. Sharing your opinion can feel like walking in a minefield. You hesitate before speaking, wondering if what you say will be used against you later. Maybe you once shared an idea, only to be mocked or told you were wrong in a condescending tone. Over time, this kind of treatment teaches you to stay silent rather than risk criticism. Dr. Lindsay C. Gibson, author of Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, explains that victims of emotional abuse often suppress their thoughts because they've been conditioned to believe their voice doesn't matter. When someone constantly invalidates your opinions, you start second-guessing yourself before you even speak. This fear doesn't just stop with the abuser. It follows you into everyday life. You might hold back in conversations with friends or avoid debates at work, worried that expressing yourself will lead to conflict or rejection. Remember this: your opinions do matter, and no one has the right to silence you. Rebuilding your confidence starts with small steps, whether it's voicing your thoughts in safe spaces or reminding yourself that your perspective is just as valid as anyone else's. Let's move on to number 3. Guilt over prioritizing yourself. Putting yourself first can feel wrong when you're dealing with a narcissist. You might feel a wave of guilt for doing something as simple as resting when you're exhausted or saying no when you're overwhelmed. This happens because narcissists condition their victims to believe that their worth is tied to serving others. Even when no one is actively pressuring you, that guilt lingers, making you feel like you should always be doing something productive or putting others ahead of yourself. Best-selling author Shannon Thomas, in Healing from Hidden Abuse, describes this as emotional servitude, where victims become so used to neglecting themselves that prioritizing their well-being feels unnatural. But here's the truth. Taking care of yourself isn't selfish. It's survival. You can't pour from an empty cup, and you deserve to rest, recharge, and set boundaries without guilt. Breaking free starts with small steps, like reminding yourself that your needs are just as important as anyone else's. Now, let's continue to number 4, over-explaining yourself. Narcissistic abuse conditions you to believe that your words and actions will always be questioned, criticized, or used against you. In her book, Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, psychologist Dr. Lindsay C. Gibson explains that victims of emotional manipulation often develop a deep fear of being misunderstood or invalidated, leading them to over-justify everything just to avoid conflict. It's like you're constantly preparing for an interrogation even when no one is challenging you. This habit doesn't just drain your energy. It keeps you trapped in the mindset that your decisions need external approval. Trauma expert Dr. Ramani Durvasula describes this as a side effect of walking on eggshells, where victims feel the need to over-explain to avoid disapproval or punishment. But here's the reality. You don't owe anyone a 5-paragraph essay on why you prefer tea over coffee. Your choices are enough, and you don't need permission to exist as you are. You shouldn't miss number 5. Struggling with decision-making. How do you expect to steer your own ship when someone else has been holding the wheel for so long? That's the reality of decision-making after narcissistic abuse. You've been trained to second-guess yourself, not because you're incapable, but because every past decision was met with criticism, blame, or manipulation. Narcissistic abuse teaches you that your decisions aren't your own. Every choice has to be double-checked or justified. Over time, this conditioning makes you hesitate, second-guess, and overanalyze everything. Dr. Pete Walker, author of Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving, explains that survivors of emotional abuse often develop a fawn response, where they defer to others to avoid conflict. You might find yourself constantly asking others, "What do you think?" instead of trusting your judgment. Listen closely. You don't need permission to trust yourself again. Start by making tiny, low-stakes decisions without overthinking, like what to eat, what music to play, or what to wear. Then, build up to bigger choices. The fear won't disappear overnight, but with practice, it will shrink. You've spent enough time doubting yourself. Now, it's time to take your power back, one decision at a time. Are you still up for number 6? Feeling anxious when your phone rings. If your heart jumps every time your phone buzzes, it's not just you being overly sensitive. It's a trauma response. When you've been in a narcissistic relationship, messages were often a source of stress, not connection. Maybe you were used to receiving sudden angry texts, guilt trips, or mind games that made you question reality. According to Dr. Leslie Vernick, author of The Emotionally Destructive Relationship, narcissists use communication as a tool of control. They make their victims feel like they must always be on guard. So now, even a harmless notification can trigger that old fear, making you brace for impact before even reading the message. This kind of anxiety doesn't just go away overnight. Your nervous system has been trained to associate phone calls and texts with danger, so it reacts before you even have time to think. Trauma expert Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, in The Body Keeps the Score, explains that the body remembers past threats and reacts accordingly, even when the present situation is safe. The good news is that you can retrain your brain. Start by reminding yourself that not every message is a trap. Pause, breathe, and take control. Your phone doesn't own you, and neither do the memories attached to it. Let's keep it moving to number 7. overanalyzing people's words and actions. Conversations stop being simple exchanges and start feeling like puzzles you have to solve. You find yourself replaying what someone said, analyzing their tone, their facial expression, and even the exact words they used. This habit comes from always being on high alert and trying to anticipate the narcissist's next move. Dr. Nina W. Brown, author of Children of the Self-Absorbed, explains that narcissists create an unpredictable environment where their victims learn to read between the lines to avoid conflict. Over time, this hypervigilance becomes second nature, even when you're talking to people who aren't a threat. The problem is that most people aren't speaking in riddles or planning some emotional ambush, but your brain, conditioned by past experiences, still assumes danger is lurking beneath the surface. The key to breaking this cycle is to remind yourself that not everything needs to be decoded. If someone is upset, they'll likely tell you. You don't have to read minds. You just have to trust that safe people communicate honestly. Here comes number 8. Having a fear of abandonment. The fear of being abandoned can feel like a constant shadow. You've learned that love comes with conditions, one wrong move, one bad day, and suddenly, someone you care about might leave. This makes relationships exhausting, because you either cling out of fear of losing someone, or push away first to avoid rejection. Psychologist Dr. Lindsay Gibson, in Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, explains that people who grow up with emotionally unavailable caregivers often develop an intense fear of abandonment. It makes them hyper-aware of any sign that someone might pull away. The problem is that this fear makes relationships harder. If you cling too tightly, people may feel suffocated. If you push them away, you create the very loneliness you're trying to avoid. Trauma expert Dr. Peter Levine in Waking the Tiger says that healing starts with recognizing that not everyone will abandon you just because someone did in the past. Safe, healthy relationships are built on trust, not fear. The key is to remind yourself that you don't have to earn love or constantly prove your worth to keep people in your life. The right ones will stay, not because you beg them to, but because they want to. Moving on to number 9. Feeling like your emotions are a burden. Did someone make you feel like your feelings were too much, or always a problem? If so, it's not because your emotions are wrong. It's because you were conditioned to believe they were. Narcissistic abuse teaches you that expressing feelings leads to rejection, mockery, or guilt-tripping. Over time, you start suppressing emotions, convincing yourself that staying silent is safer. You might also find yourself apologizing for being upset, downplaying your pain, or feeling guilty for needing support because that's what you had to do to survive. But here's the truth. Your emotions are not an inconvenience. They're human. As Nedra Glover Tawwab, author of Set Boundaries, Find Peace, puts it, people who dismiss your feelings are often uncomfortable with their own. Just because someone couldn't handle your emotions doesn't mean they're too much. The first step to unlearning this belief is allowing yourself to feel without judgment. Write down your emotions, talk to a trusted friend, or simply remind yourself, I have a right to feel this way. The more you validate your own emotions, the less power those old fears will have over you. Finally, we're down to number 10, becoming a people pleaser in the workplace. When you've been through narcissistic abuse, You might find yourself bending over backward at work just to keep the peace. You take on extra tasks, avoid saying no, and let things slide even when someone crosses a line because conflict feels dangerous. Dr. Nina W. Brown, author of Children of the Self-Absorbed, explains that survivors of narcissistic abuse often develop excessive agreeableness to avoid confrontation, fearing that standing up for themselves will lead to backlash. You may not even realize it, but your instinct to overwork and stay quiet is a survival mechanism you picked up from dealing with unpredictable people. The problem is that constantly putting others' needs before your own comes at a cost. Burnout, resentment, and self-doubt start creeping in, and you might even wonder if you're being taken advantage of. Remember this: setting boundaries won't make you a bad employee, it will make you a healthier one. You deserve to be respected at work, not just tolerated because you're easy to manage. Healing from narcissistic abuse starts with recognizing the silent ways it affects you. Once you see these patterns, you can start unlearning them. Be kind to yourself, set boundaries, and remember that your feelings matter. The more you break free from these traps, the less power they have over you. Until one day you realize their voice is gone and you're finally free.